You're listening to Cinema Red Pill. I'm Sharon. We're here with my two other permanent co-hosts right now.
Yeah, Joel.
Yeah, and Timothy.
And we're with Oscar Harding. Please introduce yourself, Oscar. Again, you've been on the episode before, but can we get to know you again one other time? For anyone who didn't listen to the past episode on Semben, please listen to that episode. It was great.
Yeah, please go back and listen to everything Sharon does. But hello, I'm Oscar Harding, based in Britain, film researcher, filmmaker. I created the African cinema subreddit that Sharon's a moderator on.
Yes.
I'm also Africa editor for the website Cinema Escapist, which Sharon is also a contributor for. And I also wrote an academic paper on the relationship between African and African American cinemas. So I'm somewhat qualified to be talking to you today.
Okay, on today's episode, our theme is going to be depictions of slave trade in film. And we're going to be speaking in reference to three specific films. It will be Daughters of the Dust, directed by Julie Dash. Adanggaman, directed by Gnoan M'Bala. Sankofa, directed by Haile Gerima. So the only thing I would want to point out before we introduce the films is how two of these directors are from the LA Rebellion, because in around the 60s to the 80s, there were UCLA graduates who are pointed out to specifically have created black cinema as an alternative to classic Hollywood cinema. And specifically Julie Dash and Haile Gerima are directors who paved the way for black cinema and what it is today. I really want Oscar to introduce these films because he has written about these films, so he knows them a lot better and what they're about compared to us, because we just saw the films and we're deciphering them right now. Oscar, please introduce the films.
Okay, so first we have Adanggaman. It's an Ivorian and Burkinabe film by Gnoan M'Bala. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And it depicts the true story of King Adanggaman, whose followers raided neighbouring villages to produce slaves for the European Atlantic slave trade. The story focuses on Osei, whose village is raided, and his friends and family are either slaughtered or captured, and he teams up with an old healer to infiltrate Adanggaman's village and rescue his girlfriend and his family. Then we have Sankofa. It's a 1993 Ghanaian and Burkinabe film directed by Haile Gerima, initially telling the story of Mona, who is a vain, self-obsessed African-American model being photographed provocatively. She is transported to the past to the slave trade, inhabiting the body of an African-American slave called Shola on a southern plantation, and the rest of the story takes place in that plantation. And then we have Daughters of the Dust, which is arguably the most well-known of the three films we're discussing. It's a 1991 film by Julie Dash. It was the first film to be directed by an African-American woman that was distributed across the US on general theatrical release.
Wow.
And it depicts the last day for a large group of inhabitants from St. Helena Island in 1902 as they leave their Geechee culture on the Gullah Sea Islands to move to the mainland US for a better life. We see the spirits of the past and relatives of old who were too old and set in their ways to leave the island, persuading their friends and family to stay. So we see the various inhabitants and their links to the island and to their past.
Okay, thank you for that. So this episode is going to be more free-falling for us, because usually I discuss film by film, but for this one we're going to put them all together and just try to discuss our theme about slave trade in film. Oscar, I would like to have you start with the discussion, please.
Sure. So, in very brief summary, I feel like we're all going to be clashing on which of these films we like and which we don't. So,
Definitely.
It's my favourite African movie that I've seen. It's the one, along with Usman Semben's Black Girl, I'd recommend to anyone who's trying to introduce themselves to African cinema. Sankofa I have some real problems with on a technical level, on generally every level, and I find it a very frustrating film just because of the potential behind it and because of what an important figure Haile Gerima is both for African and African American cinema. I argue that Gerima is the missing link, as it were, between African cinema and African American cinema. So to have a guy with a foot in both these cinemas discussing, a huge historical topic that unites the African continent and the African diaspora, it's a real missed opportunity because it starts off so strong and you're engaged from the start. But I think the single biggest problem was as soon as Mona, in the best bit of the film, goes underground to the fort and she's sort of transported back to the past and she's whipped and stripped and we hear her sort of howling as she's abused by the slavers. She's then transported, as it were, into the body of Shola.
Yes.
When actually, if you had seen Mona on the plantation, considered as a mad woman, sort of talking about how she came from the future and how things are different for African Americans and how they're also not different at all.
Yeah.
It would have it would have been more profound, it would have been more engaging, but instead it feels like the bookends of the film, which I think are the best parts of the film, and it just becomes a very generic film about life on a plantation, which has been done better in films like 12 Years a Slave, and TV shows like Roots.
Yeah. Yeah, but I also disliked Mona's character for that reason. Is she was just more of an observer. She didn't have any. I guess that was a stylistic choice, but she was just an observer. She didn't really have that much impact on the story. And I had the same issue actually in Adanggaman.
Oh no.
Yes, with Osei's character started to annoy me after like the setup, where I enjoyed his whole deal where he was like fighting with his father. I wanted to marry this girl. But beyond that, interesting things happen to the people around him, and he's just sort of floating around and watching it happen. He's always just sort of floating around, and he has this weird invincibility where he's not being killed by people and not really being thrown into harm's way. Then you slap a credit on at the end saying, oh, he became a slave. And yeah, I sort of had issues with that, which is why Daughters of the Dust was my favorite. Had a wide cast of characters and everyone was doing something. Doing things in the movie, so I was infinitely more engaged when they came into conflict with each other, and I was more sucked into the story. But like now going back to Sankofa, even what's the name of the woman Mona becomes? Shola.
Shola, yeah.
Shola is also sort of an observer.
Yeah.
I mean, they paint her as she's a victim. She's getting raped by this dude on the farm. Then her whole deal seems to be she's in love with this other interesting guy from the West Indies. And then you have Nunu, the mother character, and her son. That's a more interesting story. So Mona and the person she becomes are really pointless to me. I agree with your idea. When they set it up, I thought she was going to get transported into the past.
It was sad they missed that opportunity.
Yes, because
I think it works because probably, like as you were saying, them being observers in both Adanggaman and Sankofa.
Yeah,
I think it probably they're trying to show that helplessness. I think because even if Mona went in the past and she knows she's African American and she well spoken, well educated, she's not going to convince those other people that she's anything else. Probably you get.
Yeah.
She's still just a slave. So
I wish I'd seen her battle with that a bit.
And again, the thing you're saying again of her being more of an observer, I feel she was I think she was numbed to everything around her. I think which is a big part of slavery. There's this indoctrination and your spirit is basically broken and you're just this shell of who you used to be. Another thing I also like, my problem usually with slave films, usually slave movies involving slavery is like, usually this, like say Amistad, there will usually be this Jimon Honsu character who's going to stand and be that light in all the darkness, which really wasn't the case. Probably the character is based on a true person, but in general, these people were really helpless, and I think having a person like guys like Nat Turner, those kinds of people were very few and apart. Most of the time, these people were just sedated and whipped. But then,
shouldn't the tragedy then come from having a character that's active and free will? And which is why I also enjoyed Daughters of the Dust so much is how they were reacting. They were calling like saltwater Negroes, fresh off the boat. Saying this dude was speaking in African, how they're like trying to like slowly remove themselves from that African identity. Because they
were in an identity crisis, and that was entertaining to see.
Yeah, for me this was a new experience in terms of seeing like the African identity slowly being stripped away across these three movies. You see the beginnings of it in Adanggaman, and then you sort of see the aftermath in Daughter of the Dust.
Yes.
Then I think Sankofa is somewhere in between. So I enjoyed personally Daughter of the Dust the most because it was happening in that transitionary period where the Negroes are trying to be gentrified and calling old African beliefs hoodoo, and distancing themselves from relatives like Bilal, the guy who the last African to come off on a ship who was still a practicing Muslim. I found all those aspects interesting, how they sort of associated Africanness with something that was sort of primitive, and I felt as well helpless because the Africanness was tied to that history of slavery for them as well. So I feel like it was poisoned in their minds, and they sort of just wanted to run away from it, run away from that island and start over again. So I felt this was a really powerful films.
Yeah, and something that is universal with these three films is they didn't really find an audience.
Yeah.
Because of distribution.
Are you serious?
That makes sense.
And also the filmmakers themselves didn't make that many films. They're pretty much like, though they're from the LA Rebellion, they're also pretty much like the Sembenes, whose films were far apart.
Adanggaman in particular, one of the things I found in my research on the film is it really started to find an audience and didn't get well received critically in Africa, because it's depicting Africans as also being antagonists when it came to the European slave trade.
But that thing fascinates me because we learn about it so much in school. You definitely learned about how the African chiefs were a pinnacle part of slave trade, and they were raiding people in order to get the slaves and give the white man something for barter trade. They were being traded off for mirrors and stuff, just small what do you call it, small items. And it's an honest thing, it's the truth, but people don't want to see it. I think it's part of our history, a part of which people need to know.
But I think even when they teach those things to us, the shadow of the white slavers still looms very large in that narrative.
I like how much it is there.
Yeah, but now here, you don't see any white slavers anywhere. It's just
But there are a looming effect. You're sure that this is what's motivating the African chiefs to get slaves.
Yeah, but I think the other response was probably bad because it was us at the forefront now.
Yeah.
There was no white man coming in and here's the ram. It was just this Adanggaman dude calling all the shots and raiding these villages. So yeah, I can understand why people might have not taken to that very well, having it prominent and out there and in the mainstream.
This is one of the reasons that it's probably my favourite of the three. It feels like something truly unique that we've seen in any cinema.
Yeah.
We get plenty of films about life on the South American plantations.
Yes.
Or in the Caribbean, but we never have seen it since or before from an African perspective.
Yeah.
And especially the fact that we don't see any white Europeans in Adanggaman.
Yes.
So you're seeing the hypocrisies and the greed.
Yes.
That was also on the African side.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very important film. And whilst researching all three of these films, there was absolutely no academic analysis of Adanggaman. Nobody speaks about it. Nobody ever talks about Adanggaman.
Julie Dash's film was re-released after Beyonce's Lemonade album came out because she was using the costumes and using the time, and it was sort of a pop culture relevant thing at the time. It was exactly released after she made that video, and people decided to embrace that culture immediately when she paid attention to it.
Yeah, it is a film that we're seeing more and more as influential.
Yeah.
And it's not hard to see why. It's another sort of unfortunate thing. Julie Dash has never really been able to release films beyond Daughters of the Dust. She's done a few TV movies. She's now directing some TV with Queen Sugar. I think that's in part because of Ava DuVernay, who is one of the producers on it. And again, she is one of the most interesting American filmmakers out there, but she's never really been able to get anything made beyond this. And I read a book about the making of this, and surprise, surprise, it's a huge struggle for an African American woman, even as early as 20, 30 years ago, to get her films shown, let alone made.
Oh wow.
Okay.
That's not surprising, but sad.
Haile Gerima at least is able to keep making films, but nobody ever discusses M'Bala, and he's done a few other films, but he almost reminds me of Oliver Stone. He's an angry filmmaker, but an eloquent one, and I'd love to see more from him.
True, me too.
But beyond this film, can anyone here tell me anything about M'Bala? Do any of your friends you might discuss this with know anything about Adanggaman?
No, I actually just found out about another film he did, Au Nom du Christ, which actually has me very interested, which is basically about sects in Africa and all that, which is also another, I think, relevant issue even today.
Most of the people who listen to this podcast, at a stretch, some of them may know Daughters of the Dust. Even fewer would know Sankofa, and I highly doubt anyone would have seen or heard of Adanggaman. So what we're talking about here, as Sharon said before we started, is these are sort of rarer films.
Yeah.
Whereas, when we discussed Black Girl and Sunben last time I was on the podcast, I'm still obscure, but when people think about African cinema, they would probably think of Sunben.
Yes.
Obviously, he's like the father of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like you already pointed out, like the hypocrisy exposed in films like Adanggaman, and even Sankofa again, which has sort of this thing of you have to go back to your past, which I think is basically a weird black guilt thing, which again I've also heard of white guilt, which has been used in relation to a lot of, like, say, the Oscar, those epic movies involving slavery. What are your views on that, the two, white, black guilt, and of course I see them being explored in a lot of slave films?
So, there's probably only one film that comes to mind that I enjoy that depicts the slave trade, and that's 12 Years a Slave.
Yeah.
I love every aspect of that film, and I think it's the only one that's ever really, in terms of a film, has done justice to the horrors of it and the hypocrisies involved from the American side. The rest of them, yes, they're very much awards bait.
Yeah.
I haven't seen an attempt by a white filmmaker, however good their intentions, that has really examined slavery in any kind of interesting way. There always has to be a white saviour.
Yeah.
You do get that to some extent with Brad Pitt in 12 Years a Slave because he was a producer on the film.
Yeah.
But it doesn't ever feel quite as ham-fisted as it does in other films.
What about
slavery? I feel like we're yet to see a film made by a white European or a white American that has something interesting to say about the Atlantic slave trade. But I think there is like a white Adanggaman or a white Sankofa out there somewhere from a white filmmaker who is willing to address their part in it and their part in racial inequality. But I'm unaware of that sort of film existing. Maybe there is a film like that, but I don't know.
True.
I was having a conversation with Timothy on the way here. I don't know if there's a word for it, but that whole era. Haile Gerima strikes me as like a confrontational sort of storyteller. Anyway, like the way it begins, you have this old guy, the drummer. appearing, and it's like this accusatory tone and saying, return to your past, return to your past. It sort of sets it up in this sort of black and white way that I usually do not agree with at all. Because whenever things are cast in black and white, it sort of feels like, you're pushing a certain agenda. Then you sort of lose me a bit, which is why I prefer something like Daughters of the Dust, or even Adanggaman, which sort of straddles the line and sort of shows the hypocrisy that's going on both sides.
It doesn't really, Adanggaman doesn't really force a message on you. It just depicts a certain era that would evoke discussion and anger.
Exactly.
Again, Sankofa is just it just hits you over the head.
Yes.
Gerima's viewpoint and a message from the start. It doesn't allow you to interpret it.
Exactly. So, so by the end I was like, you've done all the thinking for me, thanks. I don't think it's one I would be interested in watching again. But you're talking about the technicals. I really enjoyed the cinematography of it all, especially that opening scene in the dungeon. Really great use of lights, great camera work. Yeah, beyond that though, it was great. Like artistically, visually, he had like a really cool color palette going on in there, and which is why I also agree with Oscar in terms of it being a shame that it doesn't quite take off where it needs to be, at least story wise.
I'd like to defend the cinematography of Adanggaman.
Yeah.
Which no one's really speaking up about.
Yeah.
There's one shot, and I forget exactly where it is in the film. It's just after the midway point. I think maybe you guys know what I'm talking about. Is at night time.
Yeah.
And I believe it's the moon.
Yeah.
And it's a shot that goes on for a while, probably a little bit too long.
Yeah.
But I probably say it's one of my favourite shots in the film ever. I think it's one of the most remarkable images I've seen in a film.
Yeah.
And I really like the cinematography generally in Adanggaman. The earlier African set stuff in Sankofa, I think the cinematography is great.
Yeah.
But I think overall it's not remarkable cinematography. If you look at something like 12 Years a Slave, every frame is a painting.
Yes.
And Steve McQueen and his cinematographer, whose name escapes me right now, they make the most of that environment.
Yeah.
And I'm surprised Gerima didn't, really. It doesn't feel like anything special when I think the landscape of the southern states in the United States has incredible potential.
Yeah, he did sort of restrict the shots, like the frame,
which I think again works
with the choice. Yeah,
I think it works again with probably the whole claustrophobia, because they always show them in the plantations when she's called Shonga and Shola have they're eating there within the plantation. They usually have that claustrophobia. They don't show there are very few shots of like the hills and all that, which I feel could have been a stylistic choice again.
That's what I felt.
It might have been using the little resources that they had. But it worked.
I think Daughters of the Dust is one of the best looking films I've ever seen.
This is
I
true.
love the cinematography.
Yeah. No, it's perfect. No, in terms of even just the movements in every frame, the sort of like the camera tracks with like the direction the wind is blowing in. Like everything just flows beautifully. Everything is well paced, well edited. I loved it. It was very coherent. It was.
No, because again, speaking about camera movement, there was, I think, only one shot I think that bothered me in Adanggaman. I think when Osei is talking to I think the father of Naka, the older guy in the settlement there. There's this shot that the camera moves. Do you remember that shot?
Yes.
It moves, and I felt it was so unmotivated. It left and then just came back, and that's one of the times I was like,
it was unmotivated.
Yeah, it was an unmotivated camera move, but it's probably the only shot I had a problem with in the whole film.
Personally, Joel, I really don't agree with you. Those movies were very incoherent. They are hard to decipher. Sankofa and Daughters of the Dust, those two films were very similar, and they kind of drift away because all the stories are interconnected and you don't even have a character you specifically want to follow throughout the film. They're just throwing on you different characters and their stories, and you're supposed to decipher their stories in the moment, and it just doesn't register for me. So those two films failed for me in that sense as a spectator. and it doesn't work. Just anyone who's listening, prepare yourself before you listen. But one thing that I think Timothy said is you were motivated to see the films again because they still stay with you. Yeah. And you want to see again what was happening, which Adanggaman doesn't have. Maybe because it's a simple story and it's very straightforward. Yeah. There's it's thinking for you. You just have an opinion immediately after. But this is the Sankofa and Daughters of the Dust are films you want to see again and try to register even more. You're sure there's something you missed. You're sure the director was pushing for something artistic and thematically relevant in the times, and you want to see it again. But they're hard to watch. They're tough to watch for me, both those two films. Mostly Daughters of the Dust. That film was very hard for me.
Yeah, then I would highly recommend you watch again. Daughters of the Dust actually has a lot of characters you want to follow.
So Sharon, what's your favourite of the three, and which do you think is the most, for your mind, is the most interesting or the best depiction or analysis of the slave trade?
Definitely my favorite is Adanggaman 2 because of the story it's telling, which is very unique and people don't get to see, and which is very true. This is not someone trying to make his own narrative about what happened. This is exactly what happened, and I was fascinated to see something we've learnt about extensively but didn't register, and being able to register it when I'm older now. So it worked for me highly, and I enjoyed the story. I really enjoyed that there were women warriors. There were things that were actually surprising me in the film, what he chose to do, and there were maybe he might have set it up just so that there could be a sort of a relationship between the two, but that narrative worked for me so hard. That film was enjoyable to watch. I felt like I was learning something, which is good too, and it was entertaining, which is great for any film, even a film that's about slave trade. And yeah, by far my favorite compared to Daughters of the Dust. Its simplicity was pinnacle for me. I love that. I feel like films which try to sell a narrative with many stories tend not to register for me.
That brings me back to a point I wanted to raise earlier. So you talked about how you've been educated in this story and you know about this, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So at what age were you educated about this story?
Very young.
This history?
Very, very young. Because we learned this in primary, which we were about 8.
Yeah. No, probably 10.
It was
not
SST.
8.
We learned it in social
roughly
studies.
8 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
it's like P5. 10 years old. Let's go
around
with 10.
Yeah.
10
when
years
about
old.
10, there's the whole.
So this is something that we're not educated in until university college level.
Really?
Yeah, wow.
Okay.
Yeah. I won't do the whole quote. The Devil Finds Work by James Baldwin.
Yeah.
And I find it very telling because I won't go off on a tangent, but as I'm sure you know, politically everything's very volatile in Britain right now.
Yeah.
Same thing here.
Our leaders, certain people in the country, everything that's happening, it's operating out of an arrogance and an unwillingness to learn from the past. Sankofa, go back to from which you came.
It's the same thing happening here, Oscar, by the way.
You should check the news.
You should see Uganda's news. You'll be amazed.
I'm not surprised. And it's the same in America as well. It's an unwillingness to address the past, which seems very timely. I think there's a discussion that 12 Years a Slave should be shown in American classrooms as part of the curriculum.
And do people agree with that?
I don't think it really progressed. I know some people have even said it should be shown in British classrooms.
Yeah.
I don't know how far those conversations went, but I would agree. There's an unwillingness to educate and address this at a young age when it's going to stick. So if you're learning about this at an older age and you're watching these films when you're older, in some ways you're already set in your ways.
Yeah.
You're unwilling to learn. And I think this is part of the problem, just politically. And again, I can't speak entirely for America.
Yeah.
I certainly can't speak for the situation in Uganda.
Yeah.
But again, nobody really saw Daughters of the Dust upon its release. Nobody knows Adanggaman, and the same for Sankofa. So these are films people should be talking about.
Yeah.
Even if they're not the best films, like I'm not a fan of Sankofa, but they're interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
And people should be seeing these as opposed to, I don't know.
Amistad?
Amistad.
I don't like that movie.
You know, a film about slavery that doesn't really have anything to say about slavery apart from, oh, there's a white saviour, wasn't slavery terrible?
Yeah.
Without actually taking responsibility.
Yeah.
Yeah, not all whites are bad is generally the sort of message in those films. Yeah, there's a one white guy that rises and
they make a big deal out of, say, the revolt on the ship.
Yeah.
Ignoring the fact that there was a crime before
all these
that.
films that we're discussing, this is just my theory.
Yeah.
I believe that, starting with Daughters of the Dust, they represent a second phase for both African and African American cinema. So I believe that both cinemas, as they were, are pretty much founded in the 60s.
Yeah.
The 60s, 70s. So I believe African cinema truly started with Black Girl, and I believe African American cinema truly started with Killer of Sheep, which is a lot later, sort of, mid 70s. Charles Burnett. If you haven't seen Killer of Sheep, I'd highly recommend it.
Okay.
But these are films. These are films that had to raise their voice to be heard. So they're films that introduce and announce themselves to the world. Daughters of the Dust, Sankofa, Adanggaman, they're part of a second phase that take responsibility for the past and are actually willing to be introspective. So the African role in the slave trade, the African American legacy, and how African Americans sort of interpret their legacy. And sort of overcoming the misleading representations by white Westerners up to this point. It doesn't just have to do that. It doesn't have to, these films have to exist just to go, oh, we're different from the way we've been depicted by white filmmakers. They're also going, oh, these are films we want to make as African filmmakers, as African American filmmakers. We have stories to tell as well that don't have to be about whites.
Yes. Yeah, but again, you said something about Charles Burnett's Kill of Sheep being the start of African American cinema. Don't you think it was probably the start of the more conscious cinema like Daughters of the Dust? Because I'm sure before that there was blaxploitation stuff, the Shafts and the like. So, don't you think it was the beginning of...
There's even the argument that blaxploitation isn't truly African American cinema.
Yeah,
because it's exploitation.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's in the word.
Yeah,
There's white
blaxploitation.
financiers.
Yeah.
Personally, there's blaxploitation films I love.
Yeah.
I really like Shaft, for example. I like things like Black Dynamite and I'm Gonna Get You Sucker, which parody those types of movies. And it's important. They're important films in that they exist and they have black protagonists.
Yeah. Shaft has a black director.
It has a black director, but it's based on a series of novels by a white author.
Oh.
Oh, really?
Okay.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
One of the few white people to receive an NAACP Image Award.
Ah.
What? That is...
What was his name, by the way?
Ernest Tidyman.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, which I didn't realise either when I first saw Shaft. I knew a black director, but I didn't realise that Shaft is actually a white creation.
Okay.
Wow.
Something like Killer of Sheep, like Black Girl, it's depicting African and African American life.
Yes.
Not necessarily in relation to white people. Obviously, with Black Girl, it is more so. She kills herself because of her white employers. But with Killer of Sheep, again, it sort of reminds me of both Daughters of the Dust and Moonlight, in that it's not really portraying a message.
Yeah.
It's just depicting African American life.
Yeah.
With no judgment, and lets you interpret things for yourself. So the world that these people exist in, to a great extent, it's because of white oppression, but it doesn't talk about white oppression. It just presents. And that's why these films work so well for me.
Okay.
And Adanggaman as well. It just presents. It's not, oh, isn't slavery terrible? It just depicts what happens. Sankofa, Gerima is saying, isn't slavery terrible? You must remember your past. Yeah.
Yeah, but what do you think, if so we left the old enslaved narrative, what do you think about more movies being made about, say, modern slavery? Do you think that's the way to go? Should we, as they were saying in the movie, always go back to our past? Or is it something we should let go of?
No, we can't let go of it.
The thing is, of the African films I've researched, not a lot of them seem to address the past. Not just the slave trade, but in general.
Yeah.
And don't directly tackle both colonialism and also, more importantly than that, a pre-colonial history.
Exactly. I think that's the biggest problem. Because I think most of our history, the one at least people study in school and all that, usually begins with the coming of, say, the British, you get. There's not really a lot of history that was, I don't know if it was destroyed or probably, but there's not really that much history. Just myths, maybe, in oral tradition.
Before you know they stopped teaching the oral tradition stuff, They removed it from syllabus.
Really?
Yeah, they used to teach us like creation myths, legends and
African myths and stuff.
Yeah, from different tribes, but it's no longer a thing.
They're going for a more Western curriculum.
Yeah.
Well, then it's sort of going back to the British problem.
Yes.
Two things we never discuss to any great extent when you're younger. Are colonialism and slavery and our role in it. And funnily enough, we don't. And we don't discuss the Revolutionary War, where America gained independence.
Yeah, independence.
What? That's shocking.
It's people being embarrassed.
Yes.
Of the mistakes we made and our failures.
Yes.
Instead, we only focus on our victories.
Yes.
So we discuss World War II and how we won it for everyone, arguably.
Yeah.
So that's what they always bring up, and they also talk about our separation from the Catholic Church and the foundation of the Church of England.
Yeah.
So only ever talking about victories and success
That's obnoxious.
means we don't address when we failed or when we've made mistakes or committed atrocities.
Yes, and you can't learn from that.
Exactly. And this is why, to some extent, we don't see, until films like Belle, we don't really see films that address our role in these things.
Okay. I guess we're done, right?
Maybe Oscar.
Oscar, do you still have something to say?
I mean, I would just say people need to go and watch these films, even though I don't like Sankofa. Some people like it, clearly.
Yeah.
I definitely think more people need to see Adanggaman. Daughter of the Dust, in large part thanks to Beyonce, is finally getting the audience it always deserved. And as I mentioned, I'd highly recommend reading James Baldwin's book of film criticism, The Devil Finds Work.
Okay. Yeah,
and check out the African Cinema subreddit.
The African Cinema subreddit and Cinema Escapist, because now we write about... also, Oscar writes about African cinema. Given that.
Also, Sharon does fantastic reviews.
Yes, and I'm going to put up an interview with the director of Wale. It was great. Thank you, Oscar, for calling us.
Always a pleasure.
Timothy and Joel, my co-hosts, thank you. This is Cinema Red Pill, and thank you for listening.